You've probably read Genesis dozens of times and completely missed the most shocking details hidden in plain sight. Those few verses about the sons of God and the Nephilim, they're describing events so catastrophic that they literally reshape the entire spiritual and physical landscape of our world. In this video, we're going to systematically reconstruct the entire forgotten world of pre-flood humanity, from the first crime in Genesis 4 all the way to the moment Noah's family stepped onto the ark. We'll uncover who the Watchers really were, why their offspring were called mighty men of renown, and how this ancient history is directly connected to prophecies about the end times. Though before we get into it, if you're new to this channel, consider hitting that like button and subscribing if you haven't already, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Thank you for joining me today. As always, I'd love to hear from you. Please introduce yourself, let us know where you're watching from, and what time it is. It really makes us feel like the global community we really are. So without further ado, let's dive in, shall we? A world lost to the flood. Beneath the waters of the Great Flood lies a forgotten world. For 1,656 years, from Adam to Noah, humanity built its first civilizations. This ancient era contains some of the most mysterious passages in all of Scripture. The text speaks of beings called the sons of God who saw the daughters of men. It tells of the Nephilim, described as mighty men of old, heroes of renown. Yet these brief verses raise profound questions that have echoed through millennia. What transpired in those lost centuries that required such complete destruction? The ancient text suggests something far more troubling than simple disobedience. They hint at a corruption so deep, so universal, that only 8 souls remained worthy of survival. This becomes more than a story of divine judgment. It transforms into a forensic investigation of humanity's first great failure. The Genesis account provides tantalizing clues scattered like fragments after a catastrophe. Extended lifespans stretching nearly a millennium. Technological advancement emerging from unexpected sources. 2 distinct lineages developing in parallel, one seeking the divine, the other building without it. And threading through it all, a mysterious violation of boundaries that accelerated the world's descent into chaos. Ancient Jewish writings expanded on these cryptic verses. Early Christian thinkers wrestled with their implications. Modern scholars continue to debate their meaning. Yet the core mystery remains. What evil could grow so absolute that it demanded the erasure of an entire world? The answer lies buried in those antediluvian years, in the choices of our earliest ancestors, and in the warning their fate provides for every generation that follows. To understand the magnitude of what was lost, we must first grasp the nature of that primordial world. The genealogies speak of men who lived 9 centuries. Methuselah's 969 years meant he could have conversed with Adam and lived to see Noah. Knowledge passed directly from the first human to the last righteous man before the flood. Imagine the accumulated wisdom, the technological advancement possible when a single craftsman could perfect his art over centuries rather than decades. Yet longevity alone cannot explain the rapid descent into corruption. The text suggests a world where the boundaries between realms grew thin, where beings of immense power walked among humans, where the offspring of forbidden unions possessed strength and stature that made them heroes of renown. This was an era when the supernatural intersected with the natural in ways that would become mere memory after the waters receded. The pre-flood world developed along 2 distinct trajectories. One line descended from Cain, built cities and developed technology. They created musical instruments, worked metal, established the foundations of civilization. The other line, through Seth, maintained connection with the divine. They preserved worship, remembered their creator, walked in fellowship with God. For generations, these 2 streams of humanity flowed in parallel, but separation could not last. When these lines began to merge, when boundaries started dissolving, the resulting corruption proved catastrophic. The text provides a chilling diagnosis. Every intention of the thoughts of human hearts was only evil continually. This was not occasional sin or periodic rebellion. This was systemic, complete moral collapse. The divine image in humanity had become so distorted that redemption seemed impossible. Consider what this meant in practical terms. Violence filled the earth. The Hebrew word suggests not just physical brutality, but a destruction of proper order. Relationships corrupted. Justice disappeared. The strong preyed upon the weak without restraint. Whatever social structures existed served only to perpetuate evil. The world had become a machine for producing wickedness. Into this darkness, one man stood apart. Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. The text calls him righteous and blameless in his generation. That final phrase carries weight. In his generation, among those who surrounded him, in the context of universal corruption, his righteousness shone brighter for the darkness around it. He maintained integrity when integrity had become extinct. The construction of the ark represented more than preparation for survival. For decades, perhaps a century, Noah built his vessel while the world continued its descent. Every beam he set, every joint he sealed, testified to coming judgment. Yet the world took no notice. They ate and drank, married and gave in marriage until the day Noah entered the ark. Normal life continued while annihilation approached. This ancient catastrophe serves as more than historical record. It stands as an archetype, a pattern that would repeat throughout human history. When corruption becomes complete, when evil grows systematic, when the cries of the oppressed reach heaven, judgment follows. The flood was not divine caprice, but divine justice. It was not destruction for its own sake, but the necessary cleansing of a world too poisoned to heal. The waters that destroyed also preserved. 8 souls entered a new world, carrying within them both the divine image and the knowledge of what human evil could produce. The old world vanished beneath the waves, its cities submerged, its achievements erased. But its lessons remained, encoded in the brief chapters of Genesis, waiting to warn future generations about the wages of unchecked evil and the possibility of finding grace even in the darkest hour. The garden and the fall, the seed of corruption. In the beginning, perfection reigned in a garden eastward in Eden. Here, the first humans walked with their Creator in the cool of the day. They tended a paradise where death had no dominion, where the natural order flowed in harmony. But this pristine state carried within it the seed of its own potential corruption, the gift of choice. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil stood as both boundary and invitation. Its fruit promised enlightenment, but delivered something far more complex. When the woman saw that the tree was good for food, pleasant to the eyes, and desirable for wisdom, she took and ate. Her husband, who was with her, did likewise. In that moment, their eyes opened to realities they were never meant to bear. The immediate consequences rippled outward like waves from a stone dropped in still water. Shame entered human consciousness for the first time. The couple who had walked naked and unashamed now scrambled to cover themselves with fig leaves. When they heard the sound of the Lord in the garden, they hid among the trees. Fear had entered paradise. But the deeper corruption went beyond emotion. The very fabric of existence began to unravel. The ground itself would now resist human effort, bringing forth thorns and thistles. Childbirth would come through pain. Most critically, death entered the human experience. Dust you are, and to dust you shall return. The immortal became mortal, the eternal became temporary. Yet perhaps the most profound change was the corruption of human will itself. The knowledge gained was not merely intellectual, but experiential. Humanity now possessed not just awareness of evil, but capacity for it. The divine image remained, but overlaid with a tendency toward destruction that would grow with each generation. The serpent's promise proved both true and false. Their eyes were opened, but what they saw would haunt their descendants for millennia. The expulsion from Eden marked more than geographic relocation. It represented a fundamental shift in the human condition. Where once they had direct access to the tree of life, now the way was barred by cherubim and a flaming sword. Eternal life was no longer their birthright, but a distant memory. They entered a world where survival required sweat and struggle, where the ground that should have been their partner became their adversary. Consider the psychological impact of this transition. Adam and Eve alone among all humans knew both states. They remembered perfection. They carried within them the memory of unbroken communion with God, of a world without fear, pain, or death. Every hardship in their new existence reminded them of what they had lost. Every conflict between them echoed the harmony they had shattered. The corruption introduced was not static but dynamic. Like a virus in a system, it would replicate and mutate with each generation. The woman's desire would be for her husband, but he would rule over her. This prediction of relational dysfunction would manifest in countless ways: power dynamics, manipulation, domination, all stemmed from this initial fracture in the human partnership. Moreover, the fall introduced a new entity into human experience: the accuser. The serpent, identified in later texts as Satan, had successfully recruited humanity into his rebellion. Humans now lived in a contested space, pulled between their original design and their corrupted nature. Every moral choice became a battlefield between these competing influences. The promise of redemption came wrapped in judgment. The seed of the woman would one day crush the serpent's head, though the serpent would bruise his heel. This proto-evangelium, this first gospel, suggested that corruption was not the final word. But the path to restoration would be long and painful, measured in millennia rather than moments. As Adam and Eve began their life outside paradise, they faced a terrible reality. They must raise children who would never know innocence as they had known it. These children would be born into a world already fractured, already dangerous. They would carry within them from birth the capacity for evil that their parents had acquired through choice. The stage was set for humanity's first tragedy outside Eden. The corruption of human nature would manifest in the most horrific way possible. Brother would rise against brother. The blood of Abel would cry from the ground, adding another layer to the curse upon the earth. Violence, absent from paradise, would become humanity's constant companion. Yet even in this darkness, grace appeared. God clothed the naked couple with garments of skin, covering their shame with sacrifice. He marked Cain to prevent his destruction despite his crime. These acts of mercy suggested that while judgment was real, it was not God's final intention for humanity. The Creator who had breathed life into dust still pursued relationship with his creation. The fall from paradise established patterns that would echo through every generation. Choice would always carry consequences. Knowledge would bring both power and pain. Relationships would tend toward dysfunction without divine intervention. And underneath it all, the human heart would wrestle with competing desires, the echo of Eden calling them toward their original purpose, and the corruption within pulling them toward destruction. Cain's city, the birth of secular civilization. East of Eden, in the land of Nod, the first city rose from the earth. Its builder was Cain, the man who had spilled the first human blood. After his brother's life seeped into the soil, after the divine curse that made him a wanderer, Cain did something unexpected. He stopped wandering. He built. The irony was sharp as flint. Condemned to be a fugitive and vagabond, Cain instead established permanence. He named his city after his son Enoch, projecting his legacy into stone and structure. This was humanity's first attempt to create security apart from divine protection. Where God had offered a mark of protection, Cain built walls. From this urban foundation emerged a lineage of remarkable innovation. Cain's descendants became pioneers of human achievement. Jabal became the father of those who dwell in tents and have livestock, establishing nomadic pastoralism. His brother Jubal created the first musical instruments, the harp and flute, bringing art into a world that had known only survival. Tubal-Cain forged bronze and iron, mastering metallurgy and weaponry. These were not small accomplishments. In just a few generations, Cain's line had developed agriculture, urban planning, music, metalworking, and complex social structures. They built what we might recognize as civilization. Yet something crucial was missing. The text never mentions these builders calling upon the Lord. Their achievements were horizontal, spreading across the earth but never reaching toward heaven. The development of technology in Cain's line followed a particular pattern. Each innovation addressed a human need or desire without reference to divine purpose. Jabal's nomadic lifestyle maximized resource exploitation. Jubal's music provided entertainment and perhaps emotional outlet. Tubal-Cain's metallurgy offered tools for construction but also weapons for war. Progress and peril advanced hand in hand. Consider the psychological dynamics at work. Cain, bearing the mark of divine protection yet separated from divine presence, poured his energy into human achievement. Unable to find rest in relationship with God, he sought it in accomplishment. His city became a monument to human potential operating independent of divine guidance. It was humanity's first attempt at self-sufficiency on a grand scale. Lamech, Cain's descendant, embodied this spiritual vacuum. He took two wives, departing from the original design of one man and one woman. His boastful song to his wives revealed the moral trajectory of this godless culture. I have slain a man for wounding me, a young man for hurting me. If Cain shall be avenged sevenfold, then Lamech 77-fold. Violence had not diminished but multiplied. Power had become its own justification. The Song of Lamech represents the first recorded poetry in Scripture, but it celebrates brutality rather than beauty. Where his ancestor Jubal had invented instruments for music, Lamech used language itself as an instrument of intimidation. He boasted of killing a young man for merely injuring him, claiming for himself even greater protection than God had granted Cain. This was hubris crystallized in verse. The technological advancement of Cain's line created capabilities that outpaced moral development. Metalworking produced not just plowshares, but swords. Urban planning created not just shelter, but fortification. Music could soothe, but also incite. Each tool carried potential for both creation and destruction, and without spiritual grounding, the balance tilted toward the latter. This parallel culture developed all the markers of advanced society: technology, art, social complexity. Yet it grew like a plant with no roots in sacred soil. Each achievement, however impressive, was built on the foundation of fraternal blood. Each innovation carried within it the potential for corruption. The city of Cain stood as humanity's first attempt to solve the problem of existence without reference to the divine. The women in Cain's genealogy, Ada and Zillah, Lamech's wives, and Naamah his daughter, appear as names without stories. Yet their inclusion hints at the social structures developing in this urban culture. Polygamy had entered human relationships. The family structure designed in Eden was already fracturing into arrangements that served power rather than partnership. We must imagine these first cities as crucibles of human ambition. Without divine law to guide them, they developed their own codes. Without eternal perspective to humble them, they reached for immediate gratification. The strong dominated the weak. The clever exploited the simple. Might made right, and technology amplified might. The legacy of Cain's city would echo through history. Every civilization that followed would face the same choice: build with reference to the divine or build in defiance of it. Every technological advancement would carry the same double potential. Every human achievement would pose the same question: does this serve the Creator's purposes or substitute for them? As the generations passed, the city builders spread across the ancient lands. Their settlements dotted the landscape, each a center of human industry and innovation. Trade routes connected them. Ideas and techniques passed from community to community. The descendants of Cain were fruitful and multiplied, filling their portion of the earth with the works of their hands. But something was building beneath the surface of this impressive civilization. The violence that had begun with one brother killing another was becoming systematized. The departure from divine design that started with polygamy was expanding into ever more creative corruptions. The city that began as refuge from wandering was becoming a fortress against heaven itself. The stage was being set for a collision between the secular ambitions of Cain's line and whatever remained of divine purpose in the world. The line of Seth, the call back to Eden. While Cain built cities in the land of wandering, another story unfolded back near humanity's first home. Eve bore another son and named him Seth, saying, "God has appointed for me another seed instead of Abel." This was more than the birth of a child. It represented a new beginning, a second chance for humanity to walk in relationship with the Creator. Seth bore a son in his own likeness and image, just as Adam had been made in God's image. This careful notation suggests continuity of something precious, the divine imprint passed from generation to generation. Where Cain's line emphasized human achievement, Seth's line preserved divine connection. The distinction would prove crucial for the world's fate. During the days of Enosh, Seth's son, something remarkable occurred. People began to call upon the name of the Lord. This simple phrase marks a watershed moment in human spiritual development. It suggests organized worship, communal recognition of the divine, perhaps even the beginning of formal religious practice. While Cain's descendants invented instruments and tools, Seth's descendants rediscovered the most ancient tool of all: prayer. The genealogy of Seth reads like a record of patient faithfulness. Each name represents a link in an unbroken chain stretching from Eden toward redemption. These were not the heroes of human accomplishment. No cities bear their names. No inventions are credited to their genius. Their legacy was simpler and more profound. They remembered. They maintained the knowledge of God through generations that increasingly forgot. Consider what this preservation required. As centuries passed, as the world changed around them, as Cain's cities grew mighty and attractive, the Sethites maintained their distinct identity. They told their children the old stories. They preserved the memory of Eden, of walking with God, of a world before corruption. They kept alive the promise that the woman's seed would one day triumph over the serpent. The names in Seth's genealogy carry meaning that speaks to their spiritual focus. Enosh means mortal or frail, suggesting human recognition of their dependent state. Canaan relates to possession or fixed position. Mahalalel means praise of God. Jared signifies descent or shall come down. Each name tells part of a larger story of humanity's relationship with the divine. Enoch stands out in this lineage like a mountain peak above clouds. While others lived and died, however long their years, Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. Here was intimacy with the divine that transcended even death. His translation became proof that the separation introduced in Eden was not absolute. The way back remained open for those who sought it. The text provides few details about Enoch's walk with God, but later traditions expanded on his story. He was seen as a prophet, a scribe of righteousness, one who received revelations about the cosmos and coming judgment. His removal from earth without experiencing death suggested possibilities beyond the curse of Eden. If one man could walk so closely with God that death itself was bypassed, what hope might exist for others? Methuselah, Enoch's son, lived longer than any human recorded in Scripture. His 969 years created a bridge across almost the entire antediluvian age. He could have known Adam personally and lived to see Noah's generation. Think of the accumulated wisdom, the first-hand accounts of Eden, the unbroken oral tradition he could preserve. His very longevity became a testimony to divine patience. Lamech of Seth's line presents a striking contrast to Lamech of Cain's line. Where Cain's Lamech sang of violence and vengeance, Seth's Lamech spoke of comfort and hope. When his son was born, he declared, "This one will comfort us concerning our work and the toil of our hands, because of the ground which the Lord has cursed." He named the child Noah, meaning rest or comfort. The preservation of worship in Seth's line was not merely ritualistic, but deeply personal. These were people who understood their need for divine relationship. They felt the weight of the curse, the difficulty of life outside Eden. But rather than trying to overcome it through technology or achievement, they sought comfort in continued connection with their Creator. As generations passed, the line of Seth faced increasing challenges. They lived in the same world as Cain's descendants. They saw the cities rising, heard the music playing, witnessed the technological advances. The temptation to abandon their simpler, faith-focused life must have grown with each generation. Yet for centuries, they maintained their distinct identity. The two lineages represented two different responses to the human condition after Eden. Cain's line said, "We will overcome the curse through our own efforts. We will build, create, and achieve our way back to paradise." Seth's line said, "We will endure the curse while maintaining relationship with the one who pronounced it, trusting in his promise of eventual redemption." But isolation between these two groups could not last forever. The world was finite. As populations grew, as territories expanded, contact became inevitable. And when the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, the careful separation that had preserved Seth's spiritual heritage began to crumble. The stage was set for a catastrophic mingling that would corrupt the entire world. The mysterious sons of God, identity crisis of an ancient phrase. Few phrases in ancient literature have generated more debate than these four words, sons of God. The Hebrew term, Bene Ha-Elohim, appears at the crucial juncture when the antediluvian world began its final descent. These beings saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves, choosing whomever they pleased. But who were they? The ancient text provides maddeningly few details. We know they were distinguished from daughters of men, suggesting some fundamental difference. We know their unions produced offspring of note. We know their actions somehow connected to the corruption that brought the flood. Beyond these sparse facts, interpretation has filled the silence with three major theories, each carrying profound implications for understanding humanity's first catastrophe. The grammar itself offers clues wrapped in ambiguity. The phrase sons of God uses the definite article in Hebrew, suggesting a specific group rather than a general category. The same construction appears elsewhere in Scripture, particularly in Job, where sons of God present themselves before the Lord in what appears to be a divine council scene. This linguistic connection has shaped much of the debate. The contrast with daughters of men, Benot Hadam, provides another piece of the puzzle. The word Adam can mean humanity in general or serve as a proper name for the first man. This ambiguity allows for multiple interpretations. Are these the daughters of humanity broadly, or specifically the daughters of Adam's line? The text's economy of words leaves room for both readings. The phrase took wives for themselves employs language that could suggest either normal marriage or something more sinister. The Hebrew verb can indicate legitimate taking in marriage, but it can also imply seizure or capture. Combined with whomever they chose, the text hints at a breakdown of proper boundaries, whether supernatural or social. The timing of this event in the narrative structure of Genesis provides crucial context. It appears after the genealogies of Cain and Seth, suggesting some connection to these lineages. It immediately precedes God's declaration about his spirit not contending with humanity forever. The placement implies this was the tipping point that triggered divine judgment. Ancient Near Eastern literature provides a backdrop that early readers would have understood. Stories of gods mating with humans were common in surrounding cultures. The Mesopotamian Gilgamesh was 2/3 divine, 1/3 human. Greek mythology was filled with demigods born from unions between gods and mortals. Against this cultural context, Genesis 6 might be offering either a corrective or an Israelite version of a common ancient motif. The most ancient interpretation, dominant in Jewish thought during the Second Temple period, identified these sons of God as angelic beings. The book of 1st Enoch, influential in early Jewish and Christian circles, elaborated extensively on this view. According to this tradition, 200 angels bound themselves by oath on Mount Hermon and descended to take human wives, teaching humanity forbidden knowledge and fathering giants. A second interpretation, gaining prominence in rabbinic and Christian thought, saw these sons of God as human rulers and judges. The Hebrew word Elohim can refer not only to God, but also to human authorities. Psalm 82 declares, "You are gods, sons of the Most High, all of you." In this reading, powerful men abused their position to build harems, taking any woman they desired regardless of consent or propriety. The third major interpretation, popularized by Augustine and dominant in Christian thought for centuries, identified the sons of God with the lineage of Seth. This view sees the tragedy as spiritual compromise. The godly line that had maintained worship and separation saw the beautiful women of Cain's worldly line and abandoned their calling for physical attraction. Holy seed mingled with common, and corruption spread. Each interpretation must wrestle with significant challenges. The angelic view must explain how spiritual beings could produce physical offspring. The ruler view must account for why such behavior, however deplorable, would trigger a universal flood. The Sethite view must justify why intermarriage between human lineages would merit such extreme judgment. The debate matters because it shapes our understanding of the nature of evil that provoked the flood. Was it supernatural invasion that corrupted humanity? Was it systemic abuse of power by human authorities? Was it the failure of the righteous to maintain their spiritual identity? Each answer implies different lessons about the kinds of corruption that threaten human society. Modern scholars have proposed variations and combinations of these views. Some suggest the sons of God were possessed humans, combining the supernatural and natural interpretations. Others argue for a royal divine ideology where kings claim divine status. Still others see mythological language describing very real but ancient power dynamics. The text's ambiguity may be intentional. Perhaps Genesis 6 deliberately uses language that could encompass multiple levels of meaning. The corruption that demanded a flood may have involved supernatural boundary crossing, human power abuse, and spiritual compromise all at once. Evil rarely operates on a single level. What remains clear through all interpretations is that something fundamental was violated. Boundaries were crossed. The proper order was overturned. What God had separated, someone joined. The result was not blessed union, but cursed offspring, not multiplication of good, but proliferation of evil. The Sons of God episode, however understood, represents a crucial escalation in humanity's departure from divine design. The angelic view, when divine beings walked the earth. The oldest interpretation speaks of a cosmic rebellion that predated the flood. According to this ancient understanding, members of the heavenly host looked upon human women with desire. These were beings created to serve in the divine throne room, messengers between heaven and earth. Yet something in the beauty of humanity's daughters stirred appetites they were never meant to feel. The book of 1st Enoch, revered by ancient Jewish communities and quoted in the New Testament letter of Jude, provides the most detailed account of this interpretation. 200 angels, led by Semyaza, bound themselves together with an oath on Mount Hermon. They knew their act was rebellion. They swore mutual curses to share the guilt, that understanding that what they planned would bring divine judgment. These watchers, as Enoch calls them, did more than take human wives. They brought with them knowledge heaven had not authorized for earth. Azazel taught metallurgy and weapon-making, accelerating human capacity for violence. Others revealed the secrets of enchantments, root-cutting, and astrology. They unveiled mysteries meant to remain hidden, giving humanity power without wisdom. The offspring of these unions were the Nephilim, beings of gigantic stature and violent disposition. Neither fully human nor fully angelic, they existed as abominations in the created order. Their appetites were insatiable. Ancient texts describe them devouring human resources, then turning to devour humans themselves. They became walking violations of natural law, their very existence a testimony to boundaries wrongly crossed. This interpretation makes sense of several puzzling biblical passages. When Jude writes of angels who did not keep their proper domain but left their own abode, he seems to reference this tradition. Peter speaks of angels who sinned and were cast down to Tartarus, chained in darkness until judgment. These New Testament authors apparently accepted the angelic interpretation as historical fact. The angelic view also explains the severity of God's response. If mere human sin were involved, however grievous, would it necessitate the destruction of all life? But if the boundary between heaven and earth had been breached, if the human gene pool had been corrupted with non-human elements, if supernatural knowledge was accelerating human evil, then a cosmic reset becomes more understandable. Consider the implications of such boundary crossing. The separation between the spiritual and physical realms serves crucial purposes in the created order. Angels were made as ministering spirits, not physical beings with reproductive capacity. Humans were created as embodied souls, designed for physical intimacy within divinely ordained limits. When angels took physical form for sexual purposes, they violated the fundamental structures of creation. The ancient texts suggest these angels could assume physical bodies, appearing as men of extraordinary beauty and power. They came to the daughters of men not as obvious supernatural beings, but as irresistible suitors. The women who became their brides may not have initially understood the nature of their husbands. Only when their children grew to impossible size and strength would the truth become undeniable. The knowledge these watchers shared proved as destructive as their sexual violations. Humanity learned to forge weapons before developing wisdom about when to use them. They gained access to spiritual technologies, enchantments, and divination without the moral framework to handle such power. It was like giving nuclear technology to toddlers. This interpretation sees the flood not just as judgment, but as necessary cleansing. The Nephilim had to be destroyed. The corrupted human bloodlines had to be eliminated. The forbidden knowledge had to be wiped from human memory, forcing civilization to begin again. Only Noah and his family, that described as perfect in his generations, maintained pure human genetics untainted by angelic admixture. Critics of this view raise significant objections. How could spiritual beings produce physical offspring? Jesus said, "Angels neither marry nor are given in marriage." The interpretation seems too mythological for modern sensibilities. It appears to borrow too heavily from pagan mythology about gods mating with humans. Defenders respond that angels in Scripture do take physical form, eating and drinking with Abraham, wrestling with Jacob. The statement about angels not marrying describes their proper state, not their rebellious potential. As for mythology, perhaps pagan stories preserve garbled memories of actual events, which Genesis records more accurately. The Dead Sea Scrolls revealed how widespread this interpretation was in ancient Judaism. Multiple texts from Qumran elaborate on the Watcher tradition. The Testament of the 12 Patriarchs, the Book of Jubilees, and various other Second Temple texts treat the angelic interpretation as established fact. This was not fringe theology, but mainstream understanding. The angelic view carries profound implications for understanding spiritual warfare. It suggests that human history involves more than human actors. It warns that rebellion against God can involve beings of immense power and intelligence. It implies that certain boundaries exist not as arbitrary rules, but as fundamental safeguards of creation's order. Cross them at cosmic peril. Whether taken literally or symbolically, the angelic interpretation offers a sobering perspective on evil's potential reach. It suggests that corruption can invade from dimensions beyond the physical. It warns that humanity's struggle involves more than human opponents, and it underscores that when heaven's boundaries are violated, heaven's judgment follows. The king's and tyrant's view: power corrupts. Absolutely, power has always been humanity's most intoxicating drug. In the ancient world, before the flood, this intoxication reached fatal levels. According to the second major interpretation of Genesis 6, the sons of God were human rulers who claimed divine status and used their position to satisfy every appetite, especially sexual desire. Ancient Near Eastern culture provides crucial context for this interpretation. Kings routinely claimed divine parentage or appointment. Egyptian pharaohs were literally sons of Ra, born from the sun god's union with the queen mother. Mesopotamian rulers traced their lineage to gods and goddesses. To be royal was to be divine, or at least semi-divine. The title Son of God was a claim to political authority wrapped in religious legitimacy. In this reading, the Genesis text describes a system of power that had become systematically corrupt. These rulers, these self-proclaimed sons of God, saw beautiful women and took them. The Hebrew construction suggests not courtship, but seizure. These were not marriages, but political acquisitions. Royal harems grew without restraint as powerful men collected women like trophies. Consider the social dynamics at work. A local ruler decides he wants a particular woman. Her consent is irrelevant. Her family's wishes don't matter. If she's already married, her husband can be eliminated or simply ignored. The ruler takes her because he can. Multiply this scenario across every center of power in the ancient world, and you have a society where normal family structures collapse under royal prerogative. This interpretation gains support from later biblical usage. Psalm 82 depicts God standing in the divine council, judging among the gods. He says to them, "You are gods, and all of you are sons of the Most High. Nevertheless, you shall die like men." These gods are clearly human judges and rulers who have failed in their responsibility to maintain justice. They are sons of God by virtue of their office, not their nature. The violence that filled the earth in those days becomes more understandable through this lens. When leaders model lawlessness, society follows. When those responsible for justice become its greatest violators, moral order collapses. The powerful taking whatever women they desired was symptomatic of broader corruption. Property rights, legal systems, social contracts all became meaningless when might made right. Ancient practices like droit du seigneur, the supposed right of lords to take virginity from brides on their wedding night, may echo these antediluvian abuses. Though historically disputed, the concept reveals how power and sexual exploitation have been linked throughout human history. The pre-flood world saw this dynamic without any restraint. The offspring of these unions, the Nephilim, need not be supernatural giants in this interpretation. They were the children of privilege and power, trained from birth in violence and domination. They became mighty men because they inherited both their father's positions and their father's character. They were men of renown because fame follows power, regardless of how it's used. This reading makes the flood a judgment on systemic injustice rather than supernatural corruption. God looked at the earth and saw violence. The Hebrew word Hamas suggests not just physical brutality, but the complete perversion of justice. The powerful had created a system where their appetites were law. The weak had no recourse. Every institution meant to protect had become a tool of oppression. The taking of multiple wives by these rulers created additional social disasters. With powerful men collecting harems, ordinary men couldn't find wives. Social stability depends on most people being able to form families. When the elite hoard reproductive opportunities, the masses face not just personal frustration, but societal breakdown. Violence becomes inevitable when young men have no hope of normal life. This interpretation resonates with patterns throughout history. From Solomon's 700 wives to Ottoman sultans' vast harems, powerful men have always been tempted to sexual excess. The corruption of power often manifests first in the bedroom, then spreads to every area of governance. Personal indulgence and public injustice go hand in hand. The biblical text's emphasis on the women's beauty becomes significant in this reading. These weren't random selections, but careful choices. The powerful took the most beautiful, leaving others with limited options. This selective pressure would have social consequences, creating hierarchies based on physical appearance and royal favor rather than character or compatibility. Religious authority likely combined with political power in these ancient tyrannies. The rulers didn't just claim civil authority, but divine right. They were sons of God who could redefine morality to suit their desires. When those who should exemplify divine justice instead embody human corruption, society loses its moral compass entirely. This interpretation explains why intermarriage between groups would trigger divine judgment. It wasn't the mixing of bloodlines per se, but the systematic abuse of power it represented. Every forced marriage was an act of violence. Every royal harem represented dozens or hundreds of disrupted families. The social fabric couldn't withstand such sustained assault. The flood, in this view, becomes God's response to irredeemable injustice. When every institution is corrupt, when power serves only itself, when the cries of the oppressed find no human answer, divine intervention becomes necessary. The waters that destroyed were also waters that cleansed, washing away systems of oppression that had become too entrenched to reform. This interpretation carries warnings for every generation. Power still corrupts. Those in authority still face temptations to abuse their position for personal gratification. The connection between political power and sexual sin. The great wickedness, diagnosing a terminal world. The text offers no ambiguity. Genesis 6, verse 5 states that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. Not occasionally evil, not mostly evil, only evil, all the time. This is a diagnosis of complete moral collapse. The Hebrew word translated as wickedness here is ra'ah. It carries the weight of active harm, deliberate injury, calculated malice. The world before the flood had moved beyond simple disobedience. It had reached a state where violence and corruption had become the default mode of human interaction. Genesis 6:11 adds another layer. The earth was corrupt before God and filled with violence. The word for violence is Hamas, meaning brutality, wrongdoing, cruelty acted out in the physical realm. This was not hidden sin. This was open, systemic, visible destruction. What does a world look like when every thought is only evil continually? Start with the individual. Conscience has ceased to function. The internal voice that whispers this is wrong has been silenced, drowned out, or twisted into something unrecognizable. The capacity for shame has eroded. Actions that would have horrified an earlier generation now pass without notice. Move to the family. Bonds of kinship offer no protection. Children are not safe from parents. Parents are not honored by children. Marriage vows mean nothing when desire or advantage call. The foundational unit of society has fractured. Expand to the community. Justice has collapsed. The strong prey on the weak without consequence. Courts, if they exist, are theaters of corruption. Agreements are worthless. Trust between neighbors has vanished. Every transaction becomes an opportunity for exploitation. The text suggests something more than social breakdown. It describes a world where the very fabric of moral awareness has unraveled. People no longer knew they were doing evil because the category of evil had lost meaning. The compass was broken. The light had gone out. Ancient Jewish commentary on this passage paints vivid pictures. The Midrash speaks of violence so pervasive that people would snatch items from market stalls, always taking just below the legal threshold for prosecution. The system itself had been gamed. Injustice had become law. Other traditions describe sexual chaos beyond description, the mixing of species, acts that violated the created order. The text itself remains vague on specifics, but the cumulative testimony of ancient interpreters suggests a world where every boundary, social, familial, natural, had been deliberately transgressed. Some scholars point to the phrase, "the earth was filled with violence," and connect it to the original cultural mandate given in Genesis 1 verse 28. Fill the earth. Humanity was supposed to fill the earth with the image of God. Instead, they filled it with Hamas. The mandate was fulfilled, but in grotesque inversion. Consider the progression. Adam and Eve disobeyed in a garden. Cain committed one deliberate act of violence against his brother. By Genesis 6, violence had become not an exception, but the totality of human civilization. The trajectory was clear. Evil left unchecked compounds, it multiplies, it metastasizes. The text emphasizes that this grieved God to his heart. The Hebrew word suggests deep pain, genuine anguish. This was not divine indifference. This was a creator watching his creation destroy itself and each other with methodical thoroughness. What specific acts constituted this wickedness? The text refuses to catalog them in detail, perhaps because the point was not the inventory of sins, but their universality. Perhaps because to describe them would be to make them imaginable and they were better left in shadow. Genesis 6:12 offers a revealing detail. God looked upon the earth, and indeed it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way upon the earth. The phrase all flesh is significant. This was not merely human sin. The corruption had spread to encompass the animal kingdom, the natural world, the very earth itself. Some interpreters see this as cosmic contamination. The angelic transgression at the chapter's beginning had introduced a spiritual toxin that spread through creation. Others see it as humanity's violence extending to animals, to ecosystems, to the land itself. The world was dying from human hands. The text presents no reformers, no protest movements, no voices crying out against the tide. Only Noah is mentioned as righteous. This suggests that dissent itself had been extinguished. Those who might have objected were either silenced, corrupted, or had simply given up. Ancient Mesopotamian flood narratives offer an interesting contrast. In the Atrahasis epic, the gods send the flood because humans were too noisy. Their proliferation and clamor disturbed divine sleep. The solution was population control through catastrophe. The biblical account offers something far more sober. The flood comes not because humanity was annoying, but because humanity had become irredeemably destructive. The issue was not noise, but violence. Not inconvenience, but corruption. The diagnosis was moral, not practical. This matters because it frames the flood not as divine pettiness, but as something closer to surgical necessity. A world where every inclination is only evil continually has no future. It cannot sustain itself. It can only consume and destroy until nothing remains. The passage forces a question that cannot be avoided. Is complete moral collapse possible? Can an entire civilization lose its ethical bearings so thoroughly that nothing redeemable remains? History offers troubling echoes. Societies where mass violence became normalized, where brutality was industrialized, where the unthinkable became routine. The biblical text suggests this had happened once before, at the dawn of human civilization, with such totality that only a complete reset could address it. Genesis 6 presents the antediluvian world not as primitive savagery, but as advanced wickedness. This was not humanity before law and custom. This was humanity after law and custom had been perfected, refined, and turned toward evil ends. Civilization itself had become the vehicle for corruption. The text leaves us with an image, God looking down at the world he had called very good and seeing it had become very evil. The contrast is absolute. The deterioration was complete, and the grief was real. This was not a world that could be reformed, redeemed, or gradually improved. This was a world that had reached terminal diagnosis, a world that required ending so that something new could begin. Noah alone, the archetype of the righteous remnant. Genesis 6 verse 8 marks a turning point with 5 simple words, "But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord." That word "but" carries enormous weight. It stands as the hinge between universal condemnation and particular grace, between total destruction and preserved life, between the end of one world and the seed of another. The contrast could not be more stark. Verse 5 describes humanity's complete corruption. Verse 8 singles out one man who stood apart. The text offers three descriptions of Noah: righteous, blameless among his generation, and one who walked with God. Each descriptor reveals something essential. Righteous in Hebrew is tzaddik. It means conforming to the right standard, meeting the measure of what should be. In a world where the standard had been abandoned entirely, Noah maintained it. While everyone around him had inverted morality, Noah preserved it. Blameless translates the Hebrew tamim, which carries connotations of completeness, wholeness, integrity. This was the same word used to describe sacrificial animals without defect. Noah was not merely good in some areas while compromised in others. He was integrated, whole. What he professed aligned with how he lived. The phrase "among his generation" is crucial. Some interpreters have used this to diminish Noah's righteousness, suggesting he was merely the best of a bad lot, a giant among dwarfs, righteous only by comparison. But the text suggests something different. To be blameless among that generation meant to be blameless while surrounded by complete corruption, to maintain integrity when every social pressure pushed toward compromise, to stand alone when the cost of standing was immense. Noah was righteous not despite his generation, but within it. That makes his righteousness more remarkable, not less. The third description carries particular significance. He walked with God. This same phrase was used only once before in Genesis, describing Enoch in the genealogy of chapter 5. Enoch walked with God, and then he was not, because God took him. To walk with God suggests ongoing relationship, intimate fellowship, consistent communion. It implies movement together, direction shared, purpose aligned. Noah's life was characterized by this daily, deliberate companionship with the divine. Consider what this meant practically. Noah lived in a world where mentioning God's name likely invited mockery, where speaking of moral standards prompted ridicule, where building an ark on dry ground made him the subject of community jokes for decades. Ancient Jewish tradition elaborates on Noah's isolation. The Midrash describes his neighbors watching him slowly construct an enormous vessel, year after year, while he warned them of coming judgment. They ignored him. They mocked him. They continued in their violence. Noah becomes the first in a long biblical pattern, the righteous remnant. One person, or a small group, who maintains faithfulness when the majority has abandoned it. Abraham in Ur, Lot in Sodom, Elijah in Israel. The pattern echoes forward through Scripture. But Noah's situation was extreme even among remnants. Abraham had a family of faith. Elijah had 7,000 who had not bowed to Baal. Noah appears to have had only his immediate family. 8 people total against an entire world. The text offers no explanation for why Noah remained righteous. It doesn't describe his conversion, his decision, his moment of clarity. He simply appears in Genesis 6 already walking with God, already righteous, already blameless. This absence of explanation is itself significant. Noah's righteousness is presented as given, not earned, as maintained, not achieved. The text focuses not on how he became righteous, but on how he remained so under impossible conditions. Genesis 6:9 calls Noah a righteous man, and the Hebrew includes the definite article, the righteous man of his time. He stood alone not because others couldn't join him, but because they wouldn't. The path was available, the standard was knowable. He simply walked it while others abandoned it. Some ancient interpreters struggled with Noah's righteousness. Later passages in Genesis show him drunk and naked in his tent after the flood. Perfect. He made mistakes. How then could he be called righteous? The answer lies in understanding biblical righteousness. It never meant sinless perfection. It meant alignment with God's purposes, faith expressed through obedience, consistent orientation toward the divine will, even when execution faltered. Noah's righteousness was sufficient for God's purposes, sufficient to preserve him, sufficient to restart human civilization. But it was not absolute righteousness. That category was reserved for one who would come much later, also entering a corrupted world, also standing against it. The text emphasizes Noah's obedience. Genesis 6:22, Noah did everything just as God commanded him. Again in 7:5, Noah did all that the Lord commanded him. The repetition underscores consistency. Noah heard and obeyed, without deviation. Consider the practical challenges. Building an ark of the dimensions described would take decades. Gathering animals would require extraordinary coordination. Storing food would demand careful planning. Every day, Noah had to choose continued obedience over reasonable doubt. The text provides no indication that Noah saw confirming signs. No small floods to validate the warning. No drops of rain to prove the prophecy. Just God's word and Noah's faithful response to it day after day, year after year, while the world watched and laughed. Ancient Jewish tradition credits Noah with preaching to his generation, warning them, calling them to repentance. The text itself never states this explicitly, but the tradition recognizes that a righteous man living among the corrupt would naturally oppose the corruption. 2 Peter 2 verse 5 in the New Testament calls Noah a preacher of righteousness. Whether this means formal proclamation or simply a life lived in stark contrast to surrounding evil, the effect was the same. Noah's existence was a rebuke to his generation. They could not claim ignorance. The righteous man lived among them. The ark rose slowly before their eyes. The warning was visible for decades. They chose not to heed it. Noah's righteousness then was not just personal piety. It served as both witness and warning. It demonstrated that maintaining moral integrity was possible even in that world. It removed excuse, it offered alternative, and it was rejected. The text presents Noah as neither superhuman nor superhero. He was simply a man who, in a world bent entirely toward evil, continued to walk with God, who found favor not because he sought it, but because he remained faithful. In a collapsing world, he stood. In universal darkness, he carried light. In complete corruption, he maintained integrity. Not perfectly, not flawlessly, but genuinely and sufficiently. He becomes the pattern for all who would later find themselves alone in their generation, surrounded by pressures to conform, mocked for their faithfulness, certain only of God's word, and their decision to trust it. Noah alone, but not truly alone, because he walked with God. Echoes in Mesopotamia, the Gilgamesh epic, and Atrahasis. The biblical flood narrative does not stand alone in ancient literature. Mesopotamia, that fertile crescent between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, produced flood stories centuries before Genesis was written down. These parallel accounts raise immediate questions about relationship, influence, and meaning. The most famous is embedded in the Epic of Gilgamesh. Dating to around 2100 BCE in its earliest forms, it tells of Utnapishtim, a man warned by the god Ea of an impending flood. He builds a great boat, saves his family and animals, and survives a deluge that destroys humanity. After the waters recede, he offers sacrifice, and the gods smell the sweet savor. The similarities to Genesis are striking: a righteous man warned by deity, a great boat constructed, animals brought aboard, total destruction of humanity, birds sent out to test for dry land, sacrifice offered afterward, a divine promise never to repeat the catastrophe. These parallels are not coincidental. They suggest shared cultural memory, common narrative tradition, or direct literary relationship. Scholars have debated for over a century which explanation best fits the evidence, but the differences matter as much as the similarities. In Gilgamesh, the flood comes because the gods cannot sleep. Humanity has multiplied and grown noisy. The din disturbs divine rest. The god Enlil grows irritated and decrees destruction, not because humans are wicked, but because they are loud. There is no moral dimension, no judgment of evil, no diagnosis of corruption, just divine annoyance at the natural consequence of human fertility. The flood becomes cosmic pest control. The god Ea opposes this decision. He warns Utnapishtim by speaking to the reed walls of his house, allowing the man to overhear divine conversation. Ea acts in defiance of the divine counsel. The gods themselves are divided. Enlil eventually regrets the destruction, not because it was unjust, but because it was excessive. After the flood, the gods descend on Utnapishtim's sacrifice like flies. They have been without offerings during the deluge and are apparently hungry. The image reduces divine beings to dependent creatures, grateful for human worship, primarily because it feeds them. Genesis presents something entirely different. God brings the flood because of human wickedness and violence. The decision is moral, not practical. God grieves rather than being merely annoyed. Noah is warned directly, not through divine subterfuge. And after the flood, God's promise to preserve the earth comes from self-imposed restraint, not regret at overreaction. The Atrahasis epic, older than Gilgamesh, offers another version. Here, the flood comes as the final solution in a series of population control measures. First, the gods send plague, then drought, then famine, finally the flood. The stated reason remains the same: humanity's noise. But Atrahasis expands the backstory. Humans were created as laborers for the gods. We exist to work the land, maintain the temples, provide offerings. When we became too numerous, our existence itself became the problem. The god Enki again warns the hero Atrahasis. Again, a great boat is built. Again, life is preserved. But the resolution is telling. After the flood, the gods institute measures to control human population naturally. They create women who cannot bear children. They establish infant mortality. They introduce death. The narrative reduces human life to a management problem. The gods need workers, but not too many. They want worship, but not excessive noise. The solution is demographic engineering to maintain optimal population levels. Genesis refuses this logic entirely. Humanity is not created to serve divine needs. God requires nothing from human labor. The command to be fruitful and multiply is never revoked. And death enters the world not as population control, but as consequence of sin. These Mesopotamian narratives come from polytheistic cultures where gods are finite, flawed, often petty beings who compete, deceive, and change their minds. The tablets recording them were found in the ruins of ancient libraries at Nineveh in royal collections where they served as both religious texts and literary entertainment. The relationship between these accounts and Genesis has generated controversy since their discovery in the mid-1800s. Some scholars argue Genesis borrowed from these earlier sources, adapting pagan mythology to monotheistic purposes. Others contend that all accounts stem from historical event distorted differently by various cultures. A third view suggests Genesis deliberately counters these narratives, that it was written partly as polemic, taking familiar story structures and infusing them with radically different theology. Same flood, different God, different reasons, different meaning. Consider the theology embedded in each version. Mesopotamian accounts present unpredictable gods acting on whim or irritation. Humans exist at divine pleasure, which can be withdrawn without warning or justice. Morality plays no role. Survival depends on having the right divine patron, not living rightly. Genesis presents a God of justice who acts from moral necessity, who grieves at having to bring judgment, who provides clear warning, and who preserves the righteous. Human life has intrinsic value. Moral behavior matters. Justice, not favoritism, determines survival. The implications are profound. In the Mesopotamian worldview, human agency is nearly meaningless. You cannot earn divine favor through righteousness because righteousness is not the issue. You can only hope for a sympathetic God's intervention. In the biblical worldview, righteousness matters absolutely. Noah survives precisely because of his character. God acts from justice, not irritation. The flood is not arbitrary, but earned by human violence. And the preservation of life stems from divine grace responding to human faith. Ancient Israelites would have known these Mesopotamian stories. During the Babylonian exile, Jewish scholars lived among these narratives, heard them recited, saw them written on temple walls. The choice to tell the flood story differently was deliberate. Genesis takes a familiar narrative framework and transforms it. The same structure: warning, boat, flood, birds, sacrifice, promise, but filled with monotheistic theology that emphasizes divine justice, human moral responsibility, and purposeful creation. Whether Genesis was written to correct, counter, or simply exist alongside these other accounts, the effect is clear. Where Mesopotamian gods are small, the biblical God is infinite. Where their gods act from self-interest, this God acts from justice. Where their narratives reduce humans to annoyances, Genesis presents humans as morally significant beings whose choices matter cosmically. The parallels confirm that the ancient world shared memory of catastrophic flood. The differences reveal what each culture believed about divinity, humanity, justice, and meaning. Both told the story of a world that ended in water, but only one told why it mattered. Echoes in Greece and beyond, global memories of a deluge. The flood narrative extends far beyond Mesopotamia. Across vast distances and separate cultures, the motif of world-destroying waters appears again and again, each version carrying distinctive elements while sharing a common core. In Greek mythology, Zeus grows weary of humanity's wickedness during the Bronze Age. The wickedness differs by account. Some cite violence, others impiety, but the result is consistent. Zeus decides to drown the world. Two figures survive, Deucalion and his wife, Pyrrha. Warned by Prometheus, they build a chest or ark and float for 9 days while the flood destroys all other humans. When the waters recede, they land on Mount Parnassus. Following divine instruction, they repopulate the earth by throwing stones over their shoulders, which transform into people. The parallels to Genesis are evident: divine judgment on human wickedness, warning given to one righteous man, survival vessel constructed, complete destruction of humanity, landing on a mountain, and repopulation of earth. Yet the differences reveal distinct cultural values. The Greek version emphasizes the mechanical nature of repopulation through stones becoming people, distancing the new humanity from the old. The focus falls less on moral renewal than on pure reset. Zeus remains firmly in control, his judgment unquestioned and absolute. Hindu tradition preserves the story of Manu, the first man, warned by a small fish he once protected. The fish grows enormous, revealed as Matsya, an avatar of Vishnu, and tells Manu to build a ship. When the flood comes, Matsya tows Manu's ship through the waters, ultimately securing it to a mountain peak. Here, the flood serves cosmic purpose beyond judgment. The waters represent chaos, returning to destroy a corrupted world's cycle before the next cycle begins. Manu becomes the progenitor of the new humanity. The narrative fits within Hindu cyclical time, where worlds are regularly destroyed and recreated. In ancient Chinese texts, Gun and then his son Yu respond to catastrophic floods by building dikes and dredging channels. While less clearly a divine judgment narrative, the motif of worldwide flooding threatening humanity's existence appears consistently. Yu's successful flood control becomes the legendary foundation of the Xia dynasty. The differences here are significant. Rather than building a vessel and waiting for divine rescue, the Chinese tradition emphasizes human engineering and effort. Floods are natural disasters requiring technological response. The narrative serves different cultural purposes but preserves the collective memory of devastating waters. Native American traditions across both continents contain flood narratives. The Ojibwe speak of the earth being covered with water, with only Nanabojo and the animals surviving on a raft. He sends animals diving to retrieve earth from below the waters to recreate land. The Inca preserved stories of a great flood sent by the creator god Viracocha to destroy giants who had offended him. Some humans survived by hiding in caves on high mountains. After the waters receded, Viracocha recreated humanity at Lake Titicaca. From Polynesia to Australia, from Celtic lands to West Africa, the pattern repeats. Waters rise, most perish, few survive, earth begins again. The universality is striking. Skeptics dismiss these as independent responses to local flooding events. Every culture lives near water, rivers overflow, tsunamis strike coastlines. Localized catastrophes become legendary, and the human mind exaggerates scale over generations. The similarities are coincidence multiplied by common human experience, but others see the distribution and consistency as pointing toward shared origin. Whether literal memory of a historical global flood or inherited cultural narrative stemming from a common ancestral tradition, the worldwide presence of the motif suggests something deeper than coincidence. Geological evidence complicates the question. Around 5600 BCE, the Black Sea underwent catastrophic flooding when Mediterranean waters breached a natural dam. The flood was rapid, devastating, and would have displaced entire populations. Some researchers suggest this event might be the historical kernel behind Near Eastern flood narratives. The end of the last ice age around 11,000 years ago brought dramatic sea level rise. Coastlines receded miles inland. Islands vanished. Populations would have experienced the ocean gradually but persistently swallowing known world. These changes occurred within human habitation and memory. Yet none of this explains the moral dimension consistently attached to flood narratives. Natural disasters are random. The flood stories across cultures are not. They are always divine response to human behavior. Judgment for sin. Reset after corruption. Cosmic do-over when humanity fails. The common elements are too specific for pure coincidence. A righteous figure warned, special preparation made, total destruction of existing humanity, survival of select few, repopulation from survivors, often animals preserved, frequently landing on mountains, usually followed by covenant or promise. Genesis shares this narrative DNA while also standing apart. It refuses the polytheistic squabbles of Mesopotamian accounts. It avoids the mechanical, impersonal quality of Greek versions. It rejects cyclical timeframes of Hindu tradition, and it grounds everything in moral causation. Where other traditions present floods as divine whim, cosmic necessity, or natural cycle, Genesis insists on ethical reason. The flood comes because of human violence, and God grieves before sending it. Noah survives not through clever engineering or divine favoritism, but through righteousness. The question remains, why do so many separate cultures remember a world-ending flood? One possibility is collective memory of actual catastrophic flooding at civilization's dawn. Whether localized events blown to cosmic proportion or something genuinely global, the deep memory persisted and shaped every culture's foundational narrative. Another possibility is psychological. The flood serves as perfect reset metaphor. Water cleanses. It destroys and renews. The narrative satisfies a deep human need to imagine starting over, wiping the slate clean, beginning again from moral zero. A third option is theological. If there was an actual antediluvian world that God judged through water, and if all humanity descends from the survivors, then of course every culture would inherit the story. The variations would reflect cultural drift over millennia, but the core would remain. Genesis offers no ethnographic commentary on other flood traditions. It simply tells its version with stark brevity. But the existence of these parallel accounts suggests the biblical writers were not creating fiction from whole cloth. They were interpreting shared cultural memory through the lens of monotheistic theology. The stories differ in their gods, their reasons, their heroes, and their meanings, but they agree on the fundamental pattern. There was a world before. It ended in water. A few survived. We descend from them. Whether history or archetype, whether memory or myth, the flood narrative persists because it speaks to something universal in human experience: the knowledge that worlds end, the hope that righteousness matters, the possibility of beginning again. Every culture tells the story differently, but every culture tells it. The science of deep time, what geology says about antiquity. The Genesis chronology compresses Earth's entire human history into a mere 1,656 years from Adam to the flood. Genealogies march from creation to catastrophe in a handful of generations, each patriarch living centuries. The world begins, corrupts, and is destroyed within what appears to be a brief window of time. Modern geology tells a radically different story. The Earth itself is approximately 4.5 billion years old. Life emerged roughly 3.8 billion years ago. Anatomically modern humans appeared around 300,000 years ago. Civilizations began rising in the Fertile Crescent around 10,000 BCE. The two timelines, biblical and geological, occupy different universes of scale. This disconnect has generated controversy for 2 centuries. When geologists first proposed deep time in the 1700s, it contradicted the accepted chronology calculated from Genesis. James Ussher's famous dating placed creation at 4004 BCE. By the 1800s, geological evidence was pushing Earth's age into millions, then billions of years. The question becomes, how do we hold these frameworks simultaneously? One approach separates genre. Genesis functions as theological literature, not geological textbook. Its purpose is to communicate who God is, who humanity is, and why the world is broken. The chronology serves that theological purpose without claiming to be scientific measurement. Geology functions as empirical science, measuring radioactive decay, analyzing rock strata, tracing tectonic movements. Its purpose is describing physical history. The timescale serves that scientific purpose without claiming theological meaning. Both can be true within their domains without requiring one to conform to the other. Consider what geology actually reveals about floods. Catastrophic flooding has occurred throughout Earth's history. The Missoula floods at the end of the last ice age sent massive walls of water across the Pacific Northwest. The Black Sea flood around 5600 BCE transformed a freshwater lake into a saltwater sea virtually overnight. These were regional catastrophes, not global ones. But to populations experiencing them, they were world-ending. The known world disappeared underwater. Everyone and everything familiar was swept away. From the perspective of survivors, It was a universal flood. Archaeological evidence shows no discontinuity, suggesting global human extinction around 2350 BCE, the traditional date for Noah's flood. Egyptian civilization continues uninterrupted through this period. The Harappan culture in the Indus Valley shows no break. Chinese dynasties proceed without apparent flood-induced gap. This creates tension only if Genesis intends to describe a geologically global flood affecting every square inch of Earth. But ancient Near Eastern cosmology understood world differently than modern science does. The world was the known world. The Earth was inhabited Earth. All often meant all within view, or all we know of. Genesis itself uses this hyperbolic language elsewhere. In Genesis 41:57, all the world came to Egypt to buy grain. This clearly means the known world facing famine, not literally every human on every continent. The linguistic pattern suggests similar understanding might apply to flood language. The geology of Mesopotamia reveals extensive flooding throughout the region's history. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers periodically overflow their banks with devastating effect. Archaeological excavations at Ur, Uruk, and other Sumerian cities show clear flood layers interrupting occupation. Some of these flood deposits date to around 2900 BCE. One particular layer at Shuruppak, home of the Mesopotamian flood hero Ziusudra, shows massive destruction. Whether this represents the historical kernel behind flood narratives remains debated, but the physical evidence confirms catastrophic regional flooding. From a resident's perspective, such floods would appear universal. Water stretching to the horizon, every nearby city destroyed, everyone known to have perished. The boat carrying a family and animals might float for days seeing nothing but water. The experience would be indistinguishable from global deluge. Genesis describes the flood lasting over a year. The rain falls for 40 days, but the text indicates waters prevailed for 150 days before beginning to recede. Noah doesn't exit the ark until month 12, day 27. This extended timeline suggests more than a simple rain event. Geologically, this duration better fits the description of massive marine transgression and regression. Seawater advancing over low-lying plains, remaining for months, slowly receding. Such events occurred multiple times during glacial melt phases. The Persian Gulf, for example, was dry land during the Ice Age and flooded as seas rose. The appearance of the rainbow after the flood has prompted speculation about atmospheric conditions. Did pre-flood Earth have different weather patterns? Genesis 2:5-6 mentions mist watering the earth before rain. Was rain a post-flood innovation? Geology offers no evidence of fundamentally different atmospheric physics in recent millennia. Rainbows require water droplets and sunlight at the right angle. The physics was the same. More likely, the covenant with the rainbow uses an existing natural phenomenon as a sign, not introduces a new one. The fossil record preserves no evidence of mass extinction around 2350 BCE. Marine species continue uninterrupted. Land animals show no bottleneck. Plant pollen sequences proceed normally. If the flood killed all air-breathing life except ark inhabitants, the genetic and fossil evidence should be dramatic. It isn't. This matters only if we interpret Genesis as claiming biological extinction of all species globally. But the text focuses on all flesh having the breath of life and specifies this as God's judgment on human wickedness. The primary concern is humanity and the world humans inhabited, not necessarily every organism on the planet. Geological deep time and biblical narrative time operate in different registers. One measures radiometric decay and tectonic movement. The other structures theological history around divine acts and human response. Trying to force either into the other's framework distorts both. The value of geology is not to prove or disprove Genesis. It's to help us understand the actual physical history of the planet. That history includes real catastrophic floods that shaped human civilization in its earliest phases. Those floods live in cultural memory, interpreted through various theological lenses. Genesis interprets flood memory through the lens of monotheism, moral causation, and divine justice. It uses the language and cosmology of its time to communicate timeless truth about God's response to human evil. Whether the waters covered every mountain peak on Earth, geologically, matters less than why the text says they did theologically. The ancient writer was not trying to satisfy modern scientific standards. Modern scientists are not trying to address ancient theological questions. Both pursuits are valid within their spheres. We can acknowledge the geological evidence of deep time and regional floods while recognizing the theological force of Genesis's narrative. The text teaches that God judges evil, preserves righteousness, and offers new beginnings. Whether that happened 4,000 years ago or represents reinterpreted memory of earlier events, the moral teaching stands. Science describes how the world works. Scripture describes what the world means. The flood narrative works at the intersection using physical catastrophe to communicate spiritual truth. Understanding geology enriches our reading. It doesn't replace it. The earth is old. Floods have shaped human history. Genesis tells one particular flood story with particular theological purpose. All three statements can coexist without requiring one to negate the others. The pre-flood longevity, myth, symbol, or lost reality. Genesis 5 presents a problem that cannot be casually dismissed. The genealogy from Adam to Noah lists lifespans that defy everything we know about human biology. Adam lives 930 years. Seth reaches 912. Enosh makes it to 905. The pattern continues through the entire line, culminating in Methuselah's staggering 969 years. Then the flood comes. Afterward, lifespans drop dramatically. Noah lives 950 years total, but only 350 after the flood. Abraham lives a mere 175 years. By the time of Moses, Psalm 90 describes human life as 70 years or 80 if we have the strength. The question presses, what are we supposed to do with these numbers? Three main interpretations have emerged over centuries of wrestling with the text. The first takes the numbers literally. These men actually lived 9 centuries. The antediluvian world operated under different biological conditions that permitted extended lifespans. Perhaps the pre-flood environment protected humans from aging factors. Maybe genetic integrity was higher near creation. Or cosmic radiation was filtered differently before the flood. This interpretation faces obvious challenges. No human population shows evidence of such longevity. No biological mechanism is known that would permit it. The oldest verified human lifespan is Gene Calment at 122 years. The gap between that and 900 plus years is not incremental but fundamental. Defenders of literal longevity point to the gradual decline after the flood as evidence of changing conditions. Something in the antediluvian world supported extraordinary age. The flood altered those conditions. Lifespans decreased accordingly. The pattern shows cause and effect, but genetics contradicts this. Telomeres shorten with age across all human populations. DNA damage accumulates. Cellular repair mechanisms degrade. These are not environmental factors, but biological limits. 900 years would require fundamentally different biology, essentially making pre-flood humans a separate species. The second interpretation treats the numbers symbolically. Ancient Near Eastern cultures used numbers to convey meaning beyond literal counting. 7 meant completeness. 12 meant governance. Large numbers expressed importance rather than duration. In this view, the extended ages emphasize the patriarch's significance. Longer life equals greater worth. Methuselah's 969 years marks him as supremely important. The numbers function as ancient biography's way of indicating this person mattered enormously. Supporting this interpretation, Mesopotamian king lists show similar patterns. The Sumerian king list records antediluvian kings reigning for tens of thousands of years. Alulim rules for 28,800 years, Alalgar for 36,000 years. 8 kings span 241,200 years total. No one interprets these Mesopotamian numbers literally. They're understood as mythological historical writing using inflated numbers to express the distant past's legendary quality. Genesis might employ the same literary convention, but with more modest inflation. The symbolic view suggests the biblical authors took this cultural convention and modified it. Where Mesopotamia used absurd numbers, Genesis used implausible but more reasonable ones. The point wasn't precise chronology, but theological genealogy showing humanity's line from creation through catastrophe to covenant. The third interpretation involves mathematical reanalysis. Some scholars suggest the numbers reflect different calendar systems. Perhaps years meant lunar months rather than solar years. Dividing the ages by 12 produces more reasonable lifespans. Methuselah would be about 80 years old, Adam around 77. But this creates new problems. Genesis 5:32 says Noah was 500 years old when he fathered Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Divided by 12, that makes Noah about 41 when his sons were born. Genesis 7, verse 6 then says Noah was 600 when the flood came, making him 50 and his sons about 9 years old. Yet those sons were married with wives joining them on the ark. The math doesn't work consistently. The numbers resist simple mathematical conversion. Another mathematical approach examines possible numerological patterns. In Hebrew, letters serve as numbers. Names therefore have numerical values. Methuselah's name yields 969, matching his lifespan exactly. This might indicate the numbers are literary constructions based on name values rather than actual ages. But not all the numbers match this pattern. Most patriarchs' names don't equal their ages. The theory works selectively, but not comprehensively. A fourth, less common interpretation suggests textual corruption. Perhaps copyists made errors over centuries of transmission. Maybe original numbers were more modest but got inflated through transcription mistakes. The Septuagint, Greek translation, and Samaritan Pentateuch show variations in some ages, supporting this possibility. Yet the variations are minor, not major. The different textual traditions might show 187 years versus 182 years, not 187 versus 87. The basic problem of extremely extended lifespans remains across all textual witnesses. What we're left with is mystery. The genealogies serve clear theological purposes. They connect Adam to Noah. They show humanity multiplying. They demonstrate the gradual corruption of creation as even lifespans fall. They emphasize particular figures like Enoch who walked with God. The precise mechanism of the numbers matters less than their narrative function. Whether literal centuries, symbolic expressions, or numerological constructions, they accomplish the same literary work, establishing continuity, marking significance, creating chronological framework. Ancient readers likely approached these numbers differently than modern ones do. They lived in cultures where genealogies routinely compressed time, where generations were sometimes skipped, where numbers carried meaning beyond arithmetic. They would have read the chapter for its theological message, not its actuarial accuracy. The modern temptation is to demand these numbers be either literally true or completely false. Either these men lived 9 centuries, or the whole text is unreliable. But ancient literature rarely works in such binary terms. Truth can be conveyed through numbers that function symbolically, while still rooting the narrative in real history. We might consider the genealogy as something like ancient historical writing that uses inflation to indicate distance. The antediluvian age was long ago, very long ago. So long ago that precise years cannot be recovered. The large numbers express that vast temporal distance while maintaining the genealogical connection. The decline after the flood is equally significant. Genesis marks a clear before and after. The world changes, conditions change, humanity changes. The lifespans chart this transformation. The message is clear. Something was lost in the flood. The world after was diminished from the world before. Whether that diminishment was biological, environmental, or purely symbolic matters less than recognizing the text marks real rupture. The flood didn't just kill people, it altered the human condition. We live on this side of that alteration in a reduced world. The longevity numbers resist easy resolution. They stand in the text as ancient testimony to a world we can barely imagine. A world where patriarchs lived long enough to see great-great-great-great-grandchildren, where oral tradition could span centuries through single individuals, where human life operated on different scale. We can't recreate that world biologically. We can't verify it historically. We can't explain it scientifically. But we can recognize what the text asserts. There was a world before. It was different, profoundly different, and it ended in water. The numbers mark that difference. How we interpret them depends on what questions we bring. If we bring questions about biology and genetics, we find frustration. If we bring questions about literary convention and theological meaning, we find depth. The pre-flood patriarchs lived long. Whether measured in actual centuries or symbolic expressions of their importance, they lived long. Long enough to watch the world corrupt. Long enough to carry memory of Eden. Long enough to see judgment coming. Long enough to matter. And in the end, all their accumulated years meant nothing when the rains began. Only righteousness mattered. Only walking with God mattered. Age however measured, provided no protection when the waters rose. The Watchers in Detail, the 1 Enoch expansion. The Book of 1 Enoch never made it into the biblical canon for most Christian traditions. It exists on the margins, preserved primarily by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, known to early church fathers quoted in the New Testament book of Jude, but ultimately excluded from the settled scriptures. Yet it offers the most detailed ancient expansion of Genesis 6, 1-4, where the canonical text provides 4 cryptic verses about the sons of God taking wives from the daughters of men. First Enoch dedicates entire chapters to explaining who these beings were, what they did, and why it mattered cosmically. The book identifies the sons of God explicitly as angels called watchers. These were heavenly beings assigned to observe humanity. Their leader was Semyaza, who looked down from heaven and saw the daughters of men were beautiful. He desired them. But he hesitated, knowing this would violate the order of creation. So he gathered 200 watchers and made them swear an oath together. They would all descend. They would all transgress. This way, no single angel would bear sole responsibility. The sin would be collective. The oath bound them in mutual guilt. They descended to Mount Hermon. The name itself is significant. It means oath or devotion in Hebrew. The location becomes the site of cosmic rebellion. 200 angels, bound by oath, abandoning their proper station. What happens next is described in shocking detail. The Watchers take human wives, not symbolically, not spiritually. The text describes physical union producing hybrid offspring. The boundaries between heaven and earth are crossed. The separation between angelic and human is violated. But that's only the beginning of their sin. The Watchers begin teaching humanity forbidden knowledge. This is where 1 Enoch expands the Genesis account most dramatically. Azazel teaches men to make swords, knives, shields, and breastplates. He introduces weaponry, the technology of warfare, the industrialization of violence. He also teaches women cosmetics and jewelry, which the text frames as deception and vanity. Semjaza teaches enchantments and root cutting, essentially sorcery and pharmacology. Armaros teaches counterspells. Barakiel teaches astrology. Kokabel teaches the constellations. Ezekiel teaches cloud knowledge. Arakiel teaches earth signs. Shamsiel teaches sun signs. Sariel teaches moon courses. This isn't mere education. The text frames it as revealing mysteries meant to remain hidden from humanity, knowledge that humans weren't ready to possess, secrets that would corrupt rather than enlighten. The offspring of these unions are the Nephilim, giants. The text describes them as 3,000 cubits tall, a clearly mythological number, meaning approximately 4,500 feet. They consume everything humans produce. They devour animals. Eventually, they begin consuming humans themselves. They drink blood. They sin against birds, beasts, reptiles, and fish. The Nephilim become instruments of oppression and consumption. They represent power without restraint, appetite without limit, strength without moral governance. The earth cries out under their violence. 4 archangels observe this catastrophe and bring it before God: Michael, Uriel, Raphael, and Gabriel. They report that the earth is being laid waste, that humanity is perishing, that the knowledge revealed by the Watchers has produced only destruction. God responds with judgment in stages. First, he sends Uriel to warn Noah of the coming flood. Then he commands Raphael to bind Azazel hand and foot and cast him into darkness in the desert, covering him with rough stones until the day of judgment. He tells Gabriel to destroy the Nephilim by turning them against each other, and he instructs Michael to bind Semyaza and the other Watchers and imprison them until Judgment Day. The Watchers are imprisoned in valleys of the earth, in chains of darkness, awaiting final condemnation. Their offspring, the Nephilim, are destroyed, but their spirits remain on earth as demons, continuing to afflict humanity. This explains evil's persistence after the flood. The giants died, but their disembodied spirits became the demonic forces plaguing the world. This narrative accomplishes several theological goals that Genesis 6 leaves ambiguous. It explains not just who the sons of God were, but what they did beyond taking wives. It provides origin for human knowledge of metallurgy, cosmetics, and astronomy. It offers etiology for evil spirits, and it positions the flood as response not just to human wickedness, but to cosmic contamination. The book frames human sin as catalyzed by angelic rebellion. Humanity didn't descend into corruption independently. They were taught, seduced, given knowledge and technology that accelerated their moral collapse. The Watchers bear primary responsibility, yet humans aren't exonerated. They welcomed the knowledge. They embraced the violence, they followed the corruption. The angels initiated transgression, but humans made it their own. Both are judged. The angels are imprisoned. Humanity is drowned. Early Christian writers knew this tradition well. Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Athenagoras, Clement of Alexandria, Tertullian all reference the Watcher narrative. Some treat it as authoritative, others cite it as interesting tradition. But it was clearly part of the early church's intellectual landscape. The New Testament letter of Jude explicitly quotes 1 Enoch 1 verse 9, attributing the words to Enoch, the seventh from Adam. Jude also references the story of Archangel Michael disputing with the devil over Moses' body, which appears in another non-canonical text. This indicates the New Testament authors viewed these traditions as valuable, even if not canonical. 2 Peter 2:4 states, God did not spare angels when they sinned, but sent them to hell, putting them in chains of darkness to be held for judgment. This aligns perfectly with the first Enoch narrative. The angels sinned. They're imprisoned in darkness. They await judgment. The connection is unmistakable. 1 Peter 3:19-20 describes Jesus after his resurrection preaching to the spirits in prison who disobeyed long ago when God waited patiently in the days of Noah. Again, the imagery matches one Enoch's imprisoned watchers who sinned in Noah's time. These New Testament passages make more sense when read against the first Enoch background. The canonical authors seem to assume readers know the fuller story. The brief references in Peter and Jude function as shorthand, invoking a narrative their audience would recognize. So why didn't 1 Enoch make it into the canon? Several reasons converge. Its late date made some cautious. Its elaborate mythology worried others. Its focus on angelology and demonology exceeded what many considered appropriate, and its existence in Greek and Ethiopic rather than Hebrew raised questions about original language and authority. But exclusion from canon doesn't mean exclusion from influence. The Watcher narrative shaped how many early Christians understood Genesis 6. It provided framework for understanding evil's cosmic dimension. It explained the origin of demons. It gave texture to the stark brevity of Genesis's account. Modern readers face a choice. We can read Genesis 6 on its own, accepting its ambiguity about the sons of God, or we can read it through the lens of 1 Enoch, understanding the canonical text as condensed version of a story its original audience knew more fully. Neither approach is wrong. The canonical text stands independent, but the non-canonical expansion illuminates. It shows us how ancient Jewish interpreters understood those mysterious verses, how they filled in the gaps, how they connected heavenly rebellion to earthly corruption. The Watcher narrative doesn't replace Genesis, it amplifies it. The fall of angels, the birth of giants, the teaching of forbidden knowledge, the corruption of creation, the imprisonment of rebels, the persistence of demonic spirits. This is one Enoch's contribution to understanding the world before the flood. A world where the boundaries between heaven and earth were violated, where knowledge came too soon and power grew too great, where angels fell and giants walked, where humanity learned what they should not have learned and became what they should not have been. A world that required ending, a world that even the flood could not entirely erase, because the spirits of that world remain chained but active, awaiting final judgment. This is the mythology that Genesis 6 inspired, the story behind the story, the ancient expansion of 4 cryptic verses into an epic of cosmic rebellion. Whether history, mythology, or interpretive tradition, it shaped how generations understood what went wrong in the beginning and why the waters had to come. Cultural legacy, giants, heroes, and the seed of myth. Genesis 6:4 contains a phrase easy to miss. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of men, who bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. Heroes of old, men of renown. This single phrase opens a door between biblical narrative and global mythology. It suggests the Genesis writer knew something we've lost, that the antediluvian age produced figures who became legendary, that real beings from that forgotten world entered cultural memory as the heroes of later myth. Consider the structure of ancient mythology. Nearly every culture has its age of heroes, beings greater than humans but less than gods, figures of extraordinary strength, often of mixed divine human parentage, who performed impossible deeds and whose stories shaped civilization. Greek mythology centers this entirely. The heroes are specifically demigods, offspring of gods and mortals. Hercules is son of Zeus and the mortal Alcmene. Perseus is son of Zeus and Danae. Achilles is son of the mortal Peleus and the sea nymph Thetis. The pattern repeats endlessly: divine father, human mother, heroic offspring. These heroes live in the ancient past. They fight monsters. They possess superhuman strength. They establish cities and kingdoms. They're renowned across known lands. And they exist in a specific epoch, the heroic age, before the fully human historical period begins. The parallels to Genesis 6 are striking. Divine beings, sons of God, unite with human women, daughters of men, producing offspring who become famous, men of renown. These beings live in the ancient past, days of old, possess extraordinary power, mighty men, and their era ends catastrophically. Could the Greek heroes be cultural memory of the Nephilim? This theory has circulated for centuries. Church fathers like Julius Africanus explicitly connected the two, arguing that pagan myths were corrupted memories of true events recorded in Genesis. The geography supports this connection. Canaan, where these traditions originated, was not isolated. Trade routes connected the eastern Mediterranean. Cultural exchange was constant. Stories traveled. By the time Homer composed the Iliad around 750 BCE, Near Eastern narratives had been circulating throughout the region for millennia. The timing fits. If we place the flood around 2500 to 3000 BCE, traditional conservative dating, and the composition of early Greek myths around 1500 to 800 BCE, there's adequate time for stories to migrate and transform. The Nephilim narrative could have reached Greek culture through Phoenician traders, Hittite interactions, or simple geographic proximity. But the connection goes deeper than Greek myth. The Norse tradition speaks of Jutnar, giants who existed before humans and opposed the gods. They're eventually destroyed in Ragnarok, a cataclysmic flood and fire that remakes the world. Again, giants in the ancient past, catastrophic destruction, world renewal. Hindu epics describe the Daityas and Danavas, powerful beings of divine descent who grew wicked and were destroyed by the gods. The Mahabharata references an age when such beings walked the earth, possessed extraordinary power, and were eventually removed to preserve cosmic order. The Celtic traditions preserve stories of the Fomorians, supernatural beings of immense strength who inhabited Ireland before humans. They're defeated and driven away, making room for human civilization. The pattern: powerful ancient beings, pre-human age, eventual removal. Even the Sumerian king list, predating Genesis's written form, describes the antediluvian age as ruled by beings of extraordinary longevity and power. After the flood, ordinary humans rule with normal lifespans. The discontinuity is marked and absolute. The Genesis phrase, men of renown, is particularly significant. The Hebrew is Anshe Hashem, literally men of the name. These were beings whose names were remembered, whose reputations transcended their lifetimes, whose deeds became legendary. This suggests the biblical writer knew these figures lived in cultural memory, that the audience would recognize, oh, those legendary heroes we hear about in stories, this is where they came from. Genesis wasn't denying the heroes' existence. It was providing their origin and explaining their end. The mythological function of giants is remarkably consistent across cultures. They represent a previous age of greater vitality but less civilization. They're strong but often foolish, powerful but ultimately doomed. They must be removed before the properly human age can begin. This mirrors the biblical narrative precisely. The Nephilim represent corrupted power. They're mighty but wicked, famous but doomed. They cannot continue into the post-flood world. Noah's age must be fully human, cleared of these hybrid beings. Some scholars see this as common mythological pattern without requiring historical connection. Joseph Campbell and others identified the age of heroes as universal stage in mythological thinking. Cultures naturally imagine a more epic past to explain present limitations. We're smaller, weaker, less vital than our ancestors because they were literally greater beings. But the specificity of detail challenges this purely psychological explanation. Why do so many cultures independently arrive at divine human hybrid offspring as the mechanism? Why do they so consistently place these beings before a world-destroying catastrophe? Why do the narratives align in structure while varying in detail? Another dimension is the monsters these heroes fight. Greek heroes battle chimeras, hydras, medusas, minotaurs. Norse heroes combat dragons and sea serpents. Mesopotamian heroes face Humbaba and divine bulls. The Bible itself mentions Leviathan and Behemoth as creatures of the ancient world. Were these creatures also products of the antediluvian corruption? If angels mixed with humans, did they also corrupt animal kinds? Genesis 6:12 states, "All flesh had corrupted their way." The phrase "all flesh" might include more than humans. The ancient world teemed with hybrid monsters in its mythology. Genesis hints this might not be pure imagination. The archaeological record shows no evidence of giants or monsters, no bones of 30-foot-tall humanoids, no skeletons of hydras or chimeras. Skeptics point to this absence as proof the stories are fiction. But mythology rarely survives in fossil form. Stories survive, narratives persist, physical evidence erodes. More interesting is the cultural function these stories serve. They establish boundaries. The age of heroes ends, so the age of laws can begin. The giants are removed so humans can flourish. The monsters are defeated so civilization can rise. The narratives mark transition from chaos to order, from might makes right to law-governed society. Genesis serves the same function theologically. The flood ends the era of violence and corruption. It removes the Nephilim and resets humanity. The post-flood world operates under covenant law, divine promise, and human accountability. The might of the heroes gives way to the righteousness of Noah. The phrase "men of renown" also carries irony. They achieved fame. Their names were known. But Genesis mentions none of them. The text refuses to memorialize them. They existed. They were powerful. They were famous. And none of that mattered when judgment came. This stands in stark contrast to how mythology typically treats heroes. Greek epics celebrate their names eternally. Norse sagas preserve their deeds in minute detail, but Genesis strips away their glory, reducing them to a single phrase explaining their origin and their elimination. The biblical text reclaims the hero narrative. It acknowledges powerful beings existed but refuses to honor them. It admits they were renowned but doesn't preserve their names. It confirms their might but emphasizes their wickedness. The heroes of mythology are, in Genesis's telling, the villains whose evil necessitated the flood. This reframing is radical. Every culture wants to honor its ancestors, especially the mighty ones. Genesis alone treats the mighty men of old as cautionary tale rather than inspiration. They were strong, yes, famous, yes, but doomed by their corruption. Modern fantasy literature continues this pattern. Giants, heroes of mixed descent, ages of wonder followed by ages of normalcy. These tropes persist because they resonate deeply. Something in human consciousness is drawn to the idea that there were greater beings once, that the world was different, that we're living in the aftermath of something grander and more terrible. Genesis 6:4 might be the textual root of this universal mythological pattern, or it might be one expression among many of a shared human memory. Either way, the connection is undeniable. The mighty men of old, the heroes of renown, the giants in the earth, they populate every culture's ancient past. And in every telling, they're gone, destroyed, removed, ended, making way for us, the lesser beings who inherited their world but not their power, who remember them in story but cannot recreate them, who look back at that age with mixture of awe and relief. Awe because they were mighty, relief because they were wicked, and the world could not contain both their power and their evil simultaneously. So the waters came, and the age of heroes ended, and the age of humans began. Theological impact, the sin of the angels, and Christian doctrine. Genesis 6 raised questions that early Christian theologians could not ignore. If angels sinned, what does that say about free will in heavenly realms? If spiritual beings can fall, how secure is salvation? If the flood was divine response to angelic transgression, what other judgments might come? The New Testament addresses these questions directly, though briefly. Jude 6 states, "The angels who did not keep their proper place but abandoned their own dwelling, veleo, these he has kept in darkness, bound with eternal chains for judgment on the great day." The language is precise. These angels had a proper place, a designated dwelling. They abandoned it. They left their assigned station. The result was immediate imprisonment, not destruction. not annihilation. Imprisonment in darkness awaiting final judgment. 2 Peter 2:4 uses even stronger language. God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell and committed them to chains of gloomy darkness to be kept until the judgment. Both passages assume readers know which angels and which sin. The texts don't explain, they reference. This suggests a shared understanding in the early church about what happened in Genesis 6. The Watcher narrative provided that shared context. The theological implications ripple outward. If angels can sin, then free will exists even in heavenly realms. Angels are not mere automatons executing divine commands. They have genuine agency. They can choose obedience or rebellion. Some chose rebellion. This solves a problem. If angels were created good and cannot sin, then Satan's fall becomes inexplicable. But if angels possess free will and can choose evil, then the existence of demons makes sense. They are angels who made the wrong choice. But it creates another problem. If salvation involves being like the angels, and angels can fall, then salvation might not be permanent. This worried early theologians deeply. The Protestant Reformation would later divide over whether believers could lose salvation. The fallenness of angels became ammunition in that debate. The answer developed slowly. Angels fell once at the beginning. Humans fall constantly throughout life. Christ's redemption covers human sin, but was not offered to angels. The angels who fell remain fallen. No atonement was made for them. No redemption is possible. Hebrews 2:16 states explicitly, "For surely it is not angels he helps, but Abraham's descendants." Christ came to save humans, not angels. The fallen angels remain in their chains. Their judgment is certain. Their doom is final. This creates the theological category of irreversible sin. Angels sinned once and cannot repent. Their nature or the severity of their transgression place them beyond redemption. Humans sin repeatedly but can repent repeatedly. Christ's sacrifice covers our ongoing rebellion in ways it does not cover angelic rebellion. The next question becomes, why? Why does divine mercy extend to humans but not angels? Several theories emerged. One holds that angels, having direct knowledge of God, sinned with full awareness in ways humans cannot. Their sin was more culpable because their knowledge was complete. Another theory suggests angels are created immortal and unchangeable. Once they choose evil, they become fixed in that choice. Humans are created mutable, capable of change. We can move from evil to good because our nature permits transformation. Angels cannot. A third view emphasizes Christ's incarnation. He took human nature, not angelic nature. Therefore, he can redeem what he assumed. He became like us, experiencing our temptations, dying our death. He never became like angels. He cannot redeem what he did not become. The Genesis 6 connection adds another dimension. These angels didn't merely rebel spiritually. They crossed the boundary between spiritual and physical realms. They left their proper dwelling to inhabit material existence improperly. They violated the created order not just ethically, but ontologically. This makes their sin unique even among angelic rebellions. Satan's fall was prideful ambition. The Watcher's fall was boundary transgression. They wanted something outside their assigned nature. They sought to be what they were not, and they corrupted creation in the process. 1 Peter 3:18-20 introduces another puzzling element. He was put to death in the body but made alive in the spirit. After being made alive, he went and made proclamation to the imprisoned spirits, to those who were disobedient long ago when God waited patiently in the days of Noah. Christ, after his death but before his resurrection, preached to these imprisoned spirits. The text doesn't say what he preached. Was it offer of redemption, announcement of victory, declaration of judgment? Interpreters disagree. The traditional view holds Christ proclaimed his victory over sin and death to the imprisoned watchers. He announced their ultimate defeat. This was not evangelism, but declaration. Not offer, but triumph. The angels who had corrupted humanity could now see that humanity's Redeemer had won. Another view suggests Christ offered even these beings one last chance at repentance, that his mercy extended even to the worst transgressors. But this contradicts Hebrews 2:16 and the consistent testimony that angelic redemption is impossible. Most theologians reject this interpretation. The passage functions primarily to emphasize Christ's authority over all spiritual realms. He descended even to the place of imprisoned angels. His domain includes the depths. His victory encompasses even the Watchers who initiated humanity's corruption. The sin of the angels becomes foundational for understanding spiritual warfare. If angels fell once, other spiritual beings might be actively hostile to humans. The demons afflicting humanity might be, as First Enoch claimed, the disembodied spirits of the Nephilim, or they might be other fallen angels who followed Satan's rebellion. Either way, Christianity inherited from Judaism the understanding that spiritual evil is real, active, and organized. Ephesians 6, verse 12 describes spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. This cosmic conflict has roots in Genesis 6, when spiritual beings first transgress their boundaries. The doctrine of angelic sin also shapes understanding of moral responsibility. If angels, created good and placed in perfect conditions, could still choose evil, then environment doesn't determine morality. Free will operates independently of circumstances. Evil can emerge even from good origins. This counters deterministic philosophies that blame evil on conditions. If angels in heaven can sin, then humans on earth cannot claim their environment made them do it. Moral agency exists. Choices matter. Even in perfect conditions, rebellion is possible. The early church fathers used Genesis 6 to combat Greek philosophical ideas about matter being inherently evil. Gnosticism taught that the physical world was created by an evil God and was fundamentally corrupt. But Genesis shows spiritual beings choosing to enter the material realm precisely because they desired it. Matter wasn't their prison, it was their temptation. This affirmed the goodness of creation. The problem wasn't physicality, the problem was boundary violation. Angels wanting to be what they weren't. Humans wanting knowledge they shouldn't possess. Creation itself remained good. Rebellion against created order made it corrupt. Augustine wrestled with these questions extensively. He rejected the angelic interpretation of Genesis 6, partly because it seemed to grant too much power to demons. If angels could reproduce with humans, what else might they do? Could demons possess genuine creative power? He preferred the Sethite interpretation to maintain clearer boundaries between spiritual and physical realms, but the Church never definitively resolved which interpretation was correct. The angelic view dominated early Christianity. The Sethite view gained ground in the medieval period. Modern Christianity is divided. The theological implications, however, transcend the interpretive debate. Whether sons of God means angels or Sethites, the passage teaches that spiritual transgression has physical consequences, that boundaries exist for good reason, that violating created order produces corruption, that God judges both spiritual and physical rebellion, and that even catastrophic judgment preserves remnant for new beginning. The imprisoned angels await final judgment. 2 Peter 2:9 connects their fate to a larger pattern. The Lord knows how to rescue the godly from trials and to hold the unrighteous for punishment on the day of judgment. The angel's imprisonment is temporary. Final judgment is coming. Revelation 20:10 describes Satan's ultimate fate, thrown into the lake of fire to be tormented forever. If Satan suffers this doom, his angels likely share it. The watchers in their chains will eventually face final condemnation. Their temporary prison becomes permanent hell. This raises the sober reality that some choices are irreversible. Some rebellions cannot be undone. Some sins place beings beyond redemption. Angels fell once and fell forever. This should make humans grateful that our rebellions can be forgiven, our falls can be recovered, our sins can be atoned. The sin of the angels thus functions as warning and contrast. Warning because it shows spiritual beings can fall. Contrast because it shows humans can be redeemed where angels cannot. Genesis 6 initiated a theological conversation that continues today. Questions about angelic nature, free will, redemption's limits, spiritual warfare, and creation's boundaries all trace back to those enigmatic verses about sons of God taking daughters of men. The flood came partly because of what those unions produced, and the theological impact of that ancient event shapes how Christians understand the spiritual realm, the nature of sin, the extent of grace, and the scope of divine judgment. Beings fell, judgment came. Mercy was shown to humans. Angels remained chained. Final judgment awaits. And between the Genesis fall and the Revelation climax, the story of redemption unfolds exclusively for humanity. The angels had their chance. They made their choice. There are no second chances in chains of darkness. The World That Was: Lessons from the Forgotten Age. 10 parts have explored the world before the flood from every angle: its corruption, its heroes, its mysteries, its myths, its science, its theology. We've examined ancient texts and modern evidence. We've traced cultural echoes and theological impacts. Now we must ask, what does this forgotten world teach us? The first lesson is about trajectory. Adam and Eve disobeyed once. Cain committed one deliberate act of violence. By Genesis 6, every inclination of every heart was only evil continuously. The progression was complete. Evil, left unchecked, doesn't plateau. It accelerates, it compounds, it metastasizes until it consumes everything. This trajectory challenges modern optimism about human nature. The Enlightenment taught that humanity improves steadily through reason and education. Genesis 1 to 6 teaches that humanity degenerates steadily through sin and corruption. Unless something interrupts the trajectory, the destination is catastrophe. The antediluvian world had everything needed for flourishing. They possessed incredible longevity, centuries to learn and grow. They developed advanced civilization rapidly: metallurgy, music, cities, agriculture. The problem wasn't lack of resources or knowledge. The problem was moral collapse despite resources and knowledge. This teaches that progress without righteousness is hollow, that advancing technology in the absence of advancing character produces more sophisticated evil. The pre-flood world apparently mastered bronze work before mastering self-control. They built cities before building justice. They multiplied knowledge without multiplying wisdom. The second lesson concerns boundaries. Whatever interpretation we accept for the sons of God, the core issue is boundary transgression. Angels crossed into human realm, Sethites intermarried with Cainites, the sacred mixed with the profane. Lines that should have remained distinct were deliberately blurred. The result was not synthesis, but corruption. The mixing didn't elevate the lower or bring balance. It contaminated the higher. The lesson is that boundaries exist for protection, that some separations are necessary for health, that refusing distinctions leads to chaos. Modern culture dismisses boundaries as restrictive. Genesis suggests they're protective. The created order includes appropriate domains for different kinds of being. When those domains are violated, order collapses. The flood came partly because beings insisted on being what they were not. The third lesson involves the remnant. Noah stood alone. Genesis emphasizes this repeatedly: one righteous man in a completely corrupt generation. The lesson is not that one person can save the world. The lesson is that God preserves faithful remnant even when majority falls. This pattern repeats throughout Scripture. Abraham in Ur, Lot in Sodom, Elijah in Israel, the prophets in exile, Jesus choosing 12 from thousands, Paul finding believers in every city. The remnant is always smaller than we expect, but never completely extinguished. The antediluvian world teaches that mass approval means nothing for truth, that cultural consensus can be universally wrong, that righteousness is measured against God's standard, not social norm. Noah was right, and everyone else was wrong. The vote was billions to one. The majority was completely corrupt. This should caution us about assuming current culture has achieved moral progress. Every generation thinks itself enlightened compared to the past. The pre-flood generation might have thought the same. They measured morality by their own standards and found themselves acceptable. God measured them by his standard and found them condemned. The fourth lesson addresses judgment. God grieves before he judges. Genesis 6:6 emphasizes this. God's heart was filled with pain. He regretted making humanity. The flood was not cold calculation. It was heartbroken necessity. This matters because it reveals divine character. God takes no pleasure in destruction. He does it because corruption left unchecked destroys everything. The 120-year warning shows divine patience. God could have sent the flood immediately. Instead, he instituted a countdown. Time for repentance. Space for change. The ark rose slowly, year by year, a visible testimony. No one could claim surprise. Everyone had opportunity. This teaches that judgment combines justice with mercy, that God delays punishment to permit repentance, that catastrophe is last resort, not first response. The flood came not because God acted hastily, but because humanity refused persistently. The fifth lesson concerns grace amid judgment. Genesis 8:1 says, God remembered Noah. Remembered doesn't mean God had forgotten. It means God acted specifically to preserve. In the midst of global catastrophe, God tracked one family. 8 people mattered enough to save when billions were lost. This is the scandal of particular grace. God doesn't save everyone, he saves some, not because others deserve destruction more. All deserve destruction. Noah himself was saved by grace, not by earning it. Righteousness meant being in right relationship with God, not achieving moral perfection. The lesson is that God's grace is always particular, always personal, always specific. He doesn't redeem abstractions, he saves individuals. Noah by name, Abraham by name. Eventually, he'll save individual believers by name. The cosmic flood frames individual salvation. The sixth lesson involves fresh starts. The flood ended one world and began another. The post-flood creation echoes Genesis 1. Waters covering earth, then receding. Land appearing, life spreading. The pattern is judgment followed by renewal. Death followed by resurrection. Ending followed by beginning. This teaches that God doesn't merely preserve the present. He creates something new from what remains. Noah's world was not the same world cleaned up. It was fundamentally different. Shorter lifespans, covenant relationship, permission to eat meat, changed atmosphere, new order. The lesson is that divine judgment makes way for divine renewal, that sometimes things must end so better things can begin, that clinging to corrupt systems prevents better systems from emerging. The flood was terrible, but it was also necessary for what came after. The seventh lesson concerns memory and myth. The flood was not forgotten. Every culture remembers it. The story was told and retold, changed and elaborated, interpreted and reinterpreted. But the core persisted. Waters rose, most died, few survived. World began again. This teaches that certain events mark humanity so deeply that they cannot be erased. That foundational stories shape all subsequent cultures. That even when details blur, the pattern remains. We are, all of us, living after the flood. Every civilization is post-diluvian. We're all descended from survivors. The lesson is that our myths contain memory, that our stories point toward history, even when history becomes story, that dismissing ancient narratives as mere fiction might mean dismissing preserved truth. Genesis claims to tell us what happened. Whether literal or theological, it claims to convey real information about real past. The eighth lesson addresses cosmic evil. Whether we interpret Genesis 6 as angelic rebellion or human intermarriage, the text teaches that evil has dimensions beyond individual sin. Entire systems become corrupt. Whole cultures embrace violence. Civilization itself can turn evil. This means fighting evil requires more than personal piety. Noah's righteousness couldn't reform his society. Individual goodness, while necessary, isn't sufficient against systemic corruption. Sometimes righteous action means building an ark, not trying to fix what's collapsing. Sometimes faithfulness means preserving, not reforming. The lesson is that evil is both personal and cosmic, individual and systemic. We face spiritual forces larger than ourselves. Cultures can become demonized. The solution comes not from within the system, but from outside it. God sends flood. God preserves remnant. God creates new beginning. The ninth lesson involves knowledge and power. The Watchers taught forbidden knowledge. Humanity learned metallurgy, cosmetics, astronomy, sorcery. Knowledge multiplied. Power increased. Violence accelerated. The lesson is that knowledge divorced from wisdom produces destruction. Modern culture worships knowledge uncritically. We assume more information equals improvement. Genesis suggests otherwise. Some knowledge corrupts. Some powers are too great for human moral capacity to handle. Technological advancement without ethical advancement leads to sophisticated evil. The lesson is that we need wisdom more than knowledge, that moral formation must precede technical formation, that power requires character to wield properly. The pre-flood world failed this test. They gained knowledge. They lacked wisdom. The result was catastrophe. The 10th and final lesson is about hope. The story doesn't end with flood. It ends with rainbow. God's promise never to destroy earth by water again. This is more than mercy. It's commitment. God binds himself to preserve the world despite humanity's continued sin. The rainbow means that judgment has limits, that grace triumphs over wrath, that no matter how corrupt things become, God will not repeat the flood. He'll use other means to address evil. He'll send prophets. He'll raise up remnants. Eventually, he'll send himself. The lesson is that after the worst judgment comes the strongest promise, that divine commitment to humanity persists despite human failure, that God doesn't give up on his creation, The flood proved God takes sin seriously. The rainbow proves God takes mercy seriously. The world before the flood was different from ours in degree but not in kind. They had longer lives but similar sins, different technology but same violence. Their corruption was more total, but our trajectory points the same direction. Every generation faces the same choice: walk with God like Noah, or walk away like everyone else. The text offers no middle ground. There's righteousness or wickedness. There's ark or flood. There's preservation or judgment. The comfortable middle, where we're not particularly evil, but not particularly righteous either, doesn't exist in Genesis 6. It's all or nothing. Total corruption met total judgment. Complete righteousness found complete grace. This binary troubles modern readers. We prefer gradations. We like nuance. But the text refuses it. The world was violent and corrupt. God sent flood. Noah was righteous. God built ark. Everyone else perished. 8 survived. That's the story. Whether we read it as literal history, theological narrative, or profound literature, the message remains. Evil reaches critical mass. Judgment becomes necessary. Righteousness preserves. Grace saves. Fresh start follows, and life continues through remnant. The world that was ended in water. The world that is lives under rainbow. The world that will be awaits final fire. Between flood and fire, we live in the tension. Remembering what was lost, grateful for what remains. Watching for signs of trajectory. Choosing to walk with God in our generation, like Noah. Alone but not truly alone. Faithful in hostile context, building ark while world mocks. Vindicated when rains begin, preserved through catastrophe, stepping onto new earth under rainbow sky. The forgotten world before the flood teaches us everything we need to know. About evil's trajectory, about righteousness's reward, about judgment's necessity, about grace's sufficiency, about fresh start's possibility. We cannot recover that world. We can learn from it. We cannot return to Eden. We can walk with God now. We cannot prevent final judgment. We can trust divine mercy today. The world that was is gone. The world that is remains. The world that will be approaches. And between them stands the same choice Noah faced: faith or folly, ark or flood, righteousness or ruin. The text ends with covenant. The story concludes with promise. The judgment gives way to grace. And humanity begins again, smaller but not destroyed, chastened but not eliminated, carrying memory of what was lost and hope for what might be. This is the legacy of the forgotten world. This is the lesson of the antediluvian age. This is the wisdom preserved in those ancient verses about a time before the flood when giants walked the earth and wickedness filled the land. Remember it. Learn from it and choose better.